The late 20th century was marked by series of war, including the First and Second World Wars and the Cold War, which saw intense competition between the United States and the Soviet Union. Among these struggles was the Vietnam-China War, during which Vietnamese guerrillas captured a young Chinese soldier and used him to the fullest for 13 years. Why was he spared in a deadly attack? What was he used for in those years? These questions have more curiosity than answers. Keep watching as we embark on a journey to discover the lost truth about this Chinese soldier. Road to the War. Why would friendly nations turn against each other? China and Vietnam were long partners, but they saw themselves on the battlefield, trying to kill each other. Relations between Vietnam and China began deteriorating sharply after the fall of Saigon. Previously, in the 1960s and early 1970s, the two countries enjoyed close relations, and China provided Vietnam with economic and indirect military support. With this support, if China and Vietnam were to fight any war in the late century, they would have been fighting a common enemy together. However, by 1974, Beijing was wary of Hanoi's aggressiveness and used military force to expel Vietnam from one of the Paracel Islands that it had occupied but was claimed by Beijing. This resulted in Vietnamese communists targeting ethnic Chinese, first taking their wealth for redistribution and finally expelling them in significant numbers from northeast Vietnam. Internationally, around this time, China was worried that Vietnam was moving too close to the Soviet Union and that a unified Vietnam would pose a security threat to China. However, this did not stop Vietnam from aligning with the Communist Soviet Union. On November 2, 1978, the two countries signed the Soviet-Vietnamese Treaty of Friendship and Cooperation. Amidst this tense relationship among once friendly countries, war was not far, but China was reluctant to fight until Vietnam invaded Cambodia on December 25, 1978. China thought that by fighting Vietnam, they would withdraw to defend their country, given the reality that Vietnam was very small compared to China in terms of military prowess. Still, it turned out to be a bloody war where Chinese soldiers had to beg for mercy. A tale of two guerrilla fighters. In the heart of the Vietnam-China War, tales of bravery and brutality echoed across the dense jungles. It was February 1979, and amidst the chaos, the Vietnamese female guerrilla squads had become infamous for their relentless attacks on Chinese rear troops. These women fought with fierce determination, showing no mercy to their enemies. However, one story stands out: the story of two guerrilla fighters who defied the unspoken code. They spared an 18-year-old Chinese soldier, an act that was against their brutality in war. But before we continue, why was China easily attacked by the Vietnamese female guerrilla squad? And what is the guerrilla squad? Keep watching to satisfy your curiosity. Vulnerable China. China is a mighty nation compared to Vietnam, and Vietnam was at the mercy of China's $200 million in aid in the 1970s. Still, when the war erupted, China had it more complicated than it was during the Korean Wars. What could have made it so? The truth is, China had a flaw that made them vulnerable in the war. China faced difficulties with personnel reserves, so they had to mobilize young soldiers who had barely completed 3 months of training. These inexperienced fighters who were not strong enough for war were sent to support companies or fighting soldiers. They were tasked with the responsibilities of organizing the supply of material and technical resources to the front lines. But there was a problem. What problem was there? Keep watching to find out. Because of their limited training in war, they became easy targets for the fearless Vietnamese guerrilla fighters who did not just have the advantage of experience, but also had geographical advantage of the area. These women attacked their headquarters with a no-mercy approach, destroying everything in their path, including food, medical supplies, equipment, ammunition, and humanitarian aid. It was a fierce way of attacking that no one could escape or fight back because they had limited training and couldn't escape because they did not know the geography of the Hanoi terrains. These women were relentless in their attack and wouldn't even let soldiers who threw their weapons in, surrender, or begged for mercy survive. The word mercy was far from them, but why were women and sometimes children recruited to fight in the war? Keep watching to know a little about guerrilla warfare and why these women fought with a no-mercy approach. The fight for survival. The word guerrilla is a Spanish word for small war. Guerrilla warfare is a form of unconventional war tactic in which small groups of women, children, rebels, partisans, paramilitaries, or unarmed or untrained people use ambushes, sabotage, or hit and run to fight against a regular army with resources. With this approach, they fight mercilessly for survival against an aggressor. However, Vietnam was getting resources from the Soviet Union, and in 1975 they received a 5-year guarantee funding of $3 billion, which was a massive advantage during the war. During the war, the Vietnamese adopted a fighting strategy that defiled China's abundant resources. The guerrilla tactic was used to counter and restrict the People's Liberation Army of China from penetrating deep into the Vietnamese territory because the area between Hanoi, the capital of Vietnam, and Lang Son was the heartland of Vietnamese industry. Instead, the Vietnamese leaders adopted a military fortress strategy that turned villages, towns, and cities into strongholds against Chinese invasion. Regular and local forces were employed to defend strategic positions along the highways and railroads. Paramilitary troops were responsible for the first line of defense, and villagers were encouraged to take up arms to help defend areas where military forces were weak. While China fought to protect its influence in the Indo-Asian region, the Vietnamese women were fighting for their survival and the preservation of their country's industrial area. Given these conditions, they did not see any reason to spare the enemy, even at the point of surrender. But one day, 2 women went against this approach and spared a young Chinese soldier. Keep watching to know why he was spared. A day of mercy. With the relentless spirit of fighting for survival, no one expected the Vietnam women to spare anybody. But a day came when mercy was shown to a young Chinese soldier in the Chinese headquarters. They spared Huan Ganang from the southeast Chinese province. At the time of the war, he was 18 years old, and it's interesting to know that he was saved against his will because he was brave and couldn't beg for mercy. He was not assigned to fight on the war front, but volunteered to serve the military by repairing military equipment, transporting wounded soldiers, and providing ammunition and fuel. These Vietnamese women from the guerrilla squad captured him and journeyed back into the deep terrains where they ambushed Chinese soldiers. Huan was not silent. He tried to escape as much as he could, but each attempt failed. He was not familiar with the terrain, so he couldn't navigate his way through without being easily captured by his captors. But why would a merciless guerrilla squad go through the pains of recapturing an enemy they could have just pulled a trigger on? Keep watching. The revelation will leave you startled. After being exhausted from many failed attempts and even the battle where he was captured, he had no choice but to follow the instructions of his captors, knowing that he might be tortured to death or used as a symbol of mocking his country. However, none of his suggestions were in the minds of his captors. They had a different plan and purpose that required a different path, and he was surprised. What did they have in mind? The answer lies in this video. The Forest of No Return, Huan Ganang's fate. Unlike the fate of most war prisoners, Huan was captured for a different reason. Along the way, Huan realized that the 2 women who captured him had diverted from their colleagues, taking him in a different direction. Despite both hands being tied and his eyes covered, his ears were receptive enough to notice the significant drop in the number of people following the path. At this point, he was only hearing his footsteps, the conversations of 2 women who captured him with personal interest. What was the conversation between 2 women and a captured young soldier? I guess you are as curious as I am. With just 2 of them and their captured prisoner, they seriously discussed their intention to move deep into the forest and live there because they were tired of the war and needed a partner for physical pleasure. But why 18-year-old Huan Ganang? While there were over 30,000 Chinese men fought, their desire for pleasure was well calculated. They were not just interested in physical pleasure, but were carried away by Huan's physical looks. They liked his appearance, and Huan was indeed a handsome teenager growing into a full adult. His looks were noticed from childhood, and growing older only increased his attractiveness. Back home in China, artists often invited him to model for their paintings with good payment for his services. But that is not all. Do you know these Vietnam guerrilla women are not the first his looks attracted? Huan was also famous among women in China. Women fell in love with him at first sight, and some would willingly ask for his hand in marriage. though he was still very young. That means he must have been really handsome. Imagine a boy drawing the attention of older women before 18, not from being a famous star, musician, or child prodigy, but just for his looks. That is rare. These women traveled deep into the forest until they reached their final destination, which reflected their carefully crafted plans. Meeting a hut made of bamboo and leaves keeps us suspecting that they have planned this for a long time and must have been the ones who built the hut house, or they just found it deserted. Arriving at their destination, they fed him, gave him ocean water to drink, and made sure he rested well after a long journey that took days. But inside this bamboo house was pleasure steeped in pains against the will of a young captured soldier. Keep watching to know how the next day unfolded for Guan in the midst of only two women who isolated themselves. Captured desires. It turned out that Juan Ganong's days in the jungle had taken a grim turn. His captors, two Vietnamese guerrilla women, kept him for reasons far beyond military purposes. Each night, Juan was forced to share a bed with them, a routine that became increasingly tormenting. He had no power, no escape, and his every move was watched. His condition made him desperate and eager to be free. One day, he faked a need to use the toilet and attempted to flee under the guise of nature's call. But the dense jungle was unforgiving to a stranger who did not know where to carefully check against dangerous reptiles. His hurried steps brought him face to face with a venomous snake. Its bite was swift, the venom coursing through his veins. Within minutes, darkness overtook him, and he collapsed in the dense vegetation with the hope of dying. But fate was not done with him. He survived the deadly bite. Who helped him? Keep watching to satisfy your curiosity. To his surprise, when Juan regained consciousness, he realized that death had not claimed him. His captors, the very women he had tried to flee, had saved him. They had found him just in time, started emergency cream, and offered him rudimentary but effective first aid. Juan's body responded to treatment and began a slow but painful recovery. One of the women, Ping, took on the role of caretaker during his healing process. She was strangely gentle, almost tender, as she nursed him back to health. Day by day, Juan's strength returned, but his spirit remained broken. He was no closer to freedom, and every attempt to escape had only deepened his entrapment. While Juan recovered, he should have been happy to survive a dangerous bite, but the harsh reality of his situation weighed on him. His captors had no intention of letting him go, and the jungle's dangers were not limited, especially for a stranger. Trapped between two fates, captivity and the wild jungle, Juan only wondered how long the unwanted pleasures would last. A forbidden love in the jungle. But something happened when he was receiving treatment from his captor. In an unexpected twist of fate, his human emotions began to connect with the care and love he was receiving. In his moment of vulnerability, he fell in love with Ping, who was her caregiver. This love blossomed, and she became pregnant with his child, put to birth, and had a family together. This union and pleasure continued for 13 years, until the day his fate kissed freedom. While exploring the area, he found a bottle with a Chinese note inside. This made him realize that he was not as far from the border as he thought, and without informing anybody, he started exploring the area, making sure he knew each route to follow. After 13 years, his captors expected him to completely forget about home and focus on the family he had in the jungle. But they were absolutely wrong. The desire to reunite with his family was still burning within him, and 13 years in the jungle exposed him to the experience of safely navigating the terrain without being hurt by wild animals or reptiles. When his captors let their guards down, he secretly escaped into the jungle in search of a way back home. It was not easy. It took him several days, but his resilience and desire to reach his family were more robust than the difficulties he faced. Eventually, he reached his hometown in China. His family members were surprised and doubtful. They embraced him to find out if he was really the one. Before now, his family gave up every hope of seeing him. Not coming back from a war that claimed the lives of over 70,000 Chinese and Vietnamese meant nothing but death. So his family was not wrong to presume his death. He carefully told his family about his experiences over the years, and the police were also informed. He was happy to meet his family but regretted never seeing his child, or Ping, with whom he eventually fell in love again. Over to you, viewers. What did you think of this cruel love story? Feel free to share your thoughts in the comment section. And before you click off, watch the next video on your screen.